Iraq did not originate with Israel. In fact, Israeli officials were skeptical at first because they wanted the United States to go after Tehran first. That's another reason, by the way, why AIPAC was initially quiet. They didn't get fully on board until Israel decided to go along. Israel backed the war after the Bush administration explained that Iraq was just the first step and that Iran would be dealt with afterwards. And at that point, key Israeli leaders like Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and Benjamin Netanyahu helped sell the war here in America through interviews with the press, op-eds in prominent American newspapers, and appearances on Capitol Hill. Fifth, consider what might have happened had the major organizations in the lobby pursued a different course of action. Suppose AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents had encouraged a lively debate and helped Congress sift the pros and cons of war in a fair-minded way. What if the Israeli government had recognized the dangers of the war and encouraged AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents to oppose it? What if the major organizations had done so on their own? It's possible that Bush, Cheney, and the neocons would have still managed to take us over the brink, but it would have been substantially more difficult. Opposition or neutrality from the major pro-Israel organizations would have encouraged Congress to think twice about the issues, given them good reasons to slow the rush for war. We might have had a real debate about the military requirements, the risks of a costly quagmire. But of course, the problem wasn't that key organizations in the lobby failed to speak out against the war. The problem was that many of them actively endorsed it. Finally, in our book, we emphasized that it would be wrong to blame American Jews for the war. In fact, surveys of American public opinion show that the American Jewish population was less supportive of the war than the American people as a whole. Rather, the blame lies with President Bush and his advisors, who made the ultimate decision, with the neoconservatives, who dreamed up the war and sold it to Bush and Cheney, and with the major groups in the lobby, who did much to sell it inside and outside the Beltway. So let me now turn to the issue of Iran, which is in some ways similar, but in other ways quite different. If Israel did not exist and there was no Israel lobby, the United States might still have a contentious relationship with Iran. Iranians resent the U.S. role in the 1953 coup that restored the Shah to power, as well as our support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. Similarly, Americans remember the hostage crisis that followed the fall of the Shah, and we worry about Iran's potential to dominate the oil-rich Persian Gulf. The United States would undoubtedly oppose any Iranian effort to obtain nuclear weapons because we have long sought to slow nuclear proliferation. So the Israel lobby is not the only reason the United States and Iran have been wary of each other. Nonetheless, both Israel and the lobby have long encouraged the United States to take a hardline stance toward Iran and sought to block any efforts at rapprochement between Tehran and Washington. In the 1990s, the United States adopted the strategy of dual containment, which committed us to deterring both Iran and Iraq simultaneously. This strategy was the brainchild of Martin Indyk again, who was then Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. And according to Indyk's associate, Ken Pollack, as well as author Trita Parsi, dual containment was adopted largely to reassure Israel. In 1994, AIPAC responded to growing Israeli concerns by preparing a lengthy paper portraying Iran as a threat to Israel and the United States alike. Throughout the rest of the decade, it pushed hard for increasingly stringent sanctions on Iran, such as the 1996 Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. It also opposed several Iranian attempts to improve relations and successfully lobbied President Clinton to block an oil deal between Iran and Conoco in 1996. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration were as hostile to Iran as they were to Iraq, and again, they believed regime change would include Tehran as well as Baghdad. In May 2003, when it looked like the United States had won a stunning victory in Iraq, William Crystal wrote in the Weekly Standard that the job wasn't finished and that the next great battle will be for Tehran. Other neoconservatives echoed this hope. The neocons' fantasies of regional transformation evaporated when Iraq turned into a costly quagmire, and it soon became clear that Saddam's overthrow had backfired by enhancing Iran's regional influence. Nonetheless, the Bush administration continued to insist Iran had to suspend all nuclear enrichment before any negotiations could begin, in the process rejecting Iranian offers to limit enrichment to little more than a small research and development effort. In essence, Washington was demanding that Iran give us what we wanted most up front, at which point we might be willing to talk about any concerns that they might have. Not surprisingly, this approach was a complete failure. Iran had exactly 0 centrifuges spinning when Bush took office, and roughly 4,000 operating when Bush's second term ended. Nonetheless, a national intelligence estimate in 2007 concluded that Iran had suspended its research on nuclear weapons back in 2003 and had no active weapons program underway. That finding was consistent, by the way, with Iran's repeated insistence that it did not seek nuclear weapons, and with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's declaration that nuclear weapons were in fact contrary to Islam. Accordingly, when Israeli leaders sought a green light to launch a preventive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities during Bush's last year in office, his response was a firm no. The last thing the United States needed in 2008 was war with another Muslim country. Even so, AIPAC managed to kill a provision to a defense bill that would have required President Bush to get congressional authorization to use force against Iran, because doing so would, in AIPAC's view, take the use of force off the table. So as the Bush administration came to a close, individuals and groups in the lobby continued to push for a hardline American approach. In September 2008, 2 well-known neocons, Michael Makovsky and Michael Rubin, produced a task force report for the Bipartisan Policy Center, which portrayed Iran as a looming threat to U.S. interests and recommended that the United States demand Iran abandon all nuclear enrichment, backed up by the use of force if necessary. Which brings us to the Obama administration. At first, Obama tried to engage Tehran through several symbolic gestures and agreed to participate in direct talks on Iran's nuclear program. The two countries nearly reached a deal in 2009 on a fuel swap that would have reduced Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium in exchange for fuel for a small research reactor. These efforts were derailed in part by the contested Iranian election of 2009, which made a compromise much more difficult for both sides, and by miscommunication and vacillation over the terms of the fuel swap deal. Yet even as Obama supposedly extended an open hand, the United States was also tightening sanctions and ramping up covert action against Iran, culminating in the Stuxnet computer virus attack in 2010. There's also good evidence that key officials in the administration expected diplomacy to fail and were just going through the motions in order to justify the use of force later. Washington continued to demand that Iran halt all nuclear enrichment. Top officials repeatedly declared an Iranian bomb unacceptable and said that all options were on the table. Pushed by Congress, Washington orchestrated a successful international campaign to tighten economic sanctions, including the blacklisting of Iran's central bank, and then, of course, openly bragged about our diplomatic success. 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated during this period, although U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton explicitly denied that the United States was involved in any way. Taken together, these developments highlight a fundamental contradiction in the entire American approach. Washington is supposedly trying to convince Tehran that the United States has no hostile intentions and that Iran therefore has no need for a nuclear deterrent. But by ratcheting up pressure, continuing to talk about military action and regime change, it is giving Iran a clear incentive to acquire the ultimate deterrent, or at least get close to that capability. Not surprisingly, Iran has responded not by capitulating to our demands, but by building additional enrichment facilities, including an underground site near Qom that is vulnerable only to high-tech bunker-busting bombs. Fears that war might be imminent rose significantly in the fall of 2010. The Netanyahu government continued to hype the danger, and Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a cover story in the September issue of The Atlantic, which concluded that Israel was likely to strike by June 2011. Goldberg's forecast was as accurate as his earlier writings about Iraq, that is to say, it was dead wrong, But the New York Times Magazine published an updated version of the same argument by Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman last January. Bergman also suggested that time was running out, that Israel's leaders were getting close to launching a preventive strike. The possibility of war with Iran soon permeated the Republican primary contest, with Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, and Rick Santorum all trying to outdo each other in their expressed willingness to use force on Israel's behalf. The war fever peaked at AIPAC's annual policy conference earlier this year. Prime Minister Netanyahu told his audience, quote, Iran must never be allowed to get nuclear weapons, declared that containment was not an option, said diplomacy had failed, and that, quote, none of us can afford to wait much longer. Senator Mitch McConnell pledged to introduce legislation authorizing the use of force, and Senator Joseph Lieberman told the audience, the question is not whether we can stop them, but whether we will choose to stop them. When it comes to Iran, all options must be on the table except for one option, and that is containment. Now, let's be clear. Lieberman was saying that war will be necessary if Iran does not give in to all our demands. President Obama sought to deflect pressure for immediate action in his own remarks to AIPAC, both by denouncing what he called loose talk about war and reiterating that he had Israel's back. Yet he also told The Atlantic's Goldberg, I do not have a policy of containment, I have a policy to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, loose talk about war has receded in recent weeks. Negotiations between Iran and the so-called P5+1 resumed in Istanbul last month. There have been some hints in the press that a deal might be in the offing which would permit Iran to continue low-level enrichment if it reduced its stockpile of more highly enriched uranium, a step that would in effect lengthen the amount of time it would take Iran to break out and acquire a bomb. It remains to be seen if such a deal can be struck, however, especially in a presidential election year. What I want to do now is compare how these developments can be contrasted with the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. There are some important similarities. The good news is there are also some key differences. The most obvious similarity, of course, is that the main advocates of a hardline approach, including the use of military force, have been the same people and groups who pushed for an attack on Iraq in 2003. Thus, William Kristol, who led the neoconservative Project for a New American Century, has since lost two new organizations, the Emergency Committee for Israel and the Foreign Policy Initiative. Both groups have hyped the threat from Iran and favor military action to keep it from crossing the nuclear weapons threshold. Kristol has said, quote, we have an engraved invitation to speak to the Iranian regime in the language it understands, force, adding, quote, we can stop talking and we can hit the regime's nuclear weapons program and set it back. Fellow neoconservative Royal Mark Garect, another prominent Iraq war advocate, began calling for an attack on Iran in 2010 and wrote after reports surfaced of an alleged Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, quote, the White House needs to respond militarily to this outrage. If we don't, we are asking for it. Michael Makovsky has continued to release alarmist reports of Iran's nuclear progress, writing in 2012 that the United States needs to make clear Iran faces a choice. It can either abandon its nuclear program or have it destroyed militarily by the United States or Israel. As you would expect,